Hi there, my name is Kelly Herbig. I am a virtual content specialist for special education social studies grades 3 through 5. And today I'm going to talk to you about how you can use total physical response, otherwise known as TPR, to teach vocabulary. So, total physical response is a method for teaching language, and it pairs movement with a new language or a new vocabulary word. It was developed by James J. Asher, and I highly recommend that you Google total physical response and the name of the creator if you would like to learn more. But realistically, it's just a kinesthetic and engaging way to learn new words and phrases. So, why should we use TPR or total physical response to teach vocabulary? First, it pairs movement with learning, which we know is really beneficial for the brain. It also gives us better student engagement. It's really fun, it's different than what they're used to, and they can get involved. It definitely supports kinesthetic learners, and I think that this piece is especially important if you have someone with an IEP and the IEP states that they're a kinesthetic learner. So, using this strategy, TPR, to teach vocabulary can be just yet another way that you reach the goals or reach the needs of the IEP. It also supports memory. So we know that kind of pairing these two things together will help students remember it better. And this can be used in large or small groups, and it's really easy to prep. You just have to create a movement for a new word or phrase that you want to teach. But this is really great to use whole class with all of your learners. You can also use it in a small group with some learners who need additional support. It can be used in many different situations. Today, I'm going to be specifically focusing in on grade 3, the Unit 4 China case study unit. However, you can use this strategy with any grade level that you're teaching. It works for pre-K all the way up through even 12th grade. So before we get started, I just want to review the different tiers of vocabulary so that we can remember which ones we should really use to do this work with. So the tier 1 words are those everyday words that students are familiar with. Those are not the words that we're really going to want to use TPR to teach because they likely already understand those very well. And then we have tier 3 words, which belong in specific subjects. So an example would be equation or photosynthesis. Again, those tier 3 words aren't really what we're going to be using to teach this vocabulary strategy, or to use this vocabulary strategy. Because they're very specific to those subject areas, students aren't likely going to have to use them a lot outside of it. So what we want to do is we want to focus in on those tier 2 words. So tier 2 words are those academic vocabulary words that it's likely that they might not know, or they might not know well enough, that we want them to get to know really well because they're going to have to use it across subject areas. So now we're going to take a look at some of the slides from this lesson and see if we can find any tier 2 vocabulary words. I like to even start just by looking at the objective because that's going to have the most important words for the students to know in it. And if you're looking at the lesson objective in social studies and you're noticing words that you might have to teach your students, then I would definitely recommend making those the top words that you want to teach because that's going to be really essential to the teaching point and the objective. So even just looking at the lesson objective from this lesson, it says explore how trade along the Silk Road led to the exchange of goods and ideas. So I'm seeing the word trade, but I do think that my students would know the word trade. Your students might have a harder time with that, so maybe you'll choose that one. But I think my students know the word trade. They're often, before COVID, trading things at lunch. And then I'm looking at even the word Silk Road. So that one is definitely a tier 3 vocabulary word. They're only really going to need to use it when talking about the Silk Road. So that's not really a word or phrase I want to focus on. But then I'm looking at this word exchange, and exchange is actually a really great tier 2 word that I'm going to want to teach my students because I really want them to understand what that word means, and I'm not quite sure that they have the full grasp on it. I think it's important to note too that sometimes you have words that, you think, oh, I think my student knows that, but you want to ask yourself too, do they know it well enough? Do they know it like I really want them to know it? So even if they've heard it before, they can kind of guess what it is, you might still want to teach into it explicitly because it's going to help them understand the social studies lesson. I even have this word goods here, and I'm even thinking that might be a really good word to teach. Students obviously know the word good, but I don't think they use the word good to talk about a product or something that's traded. And so I actually would like to maybe teach this with my students as well. Again, this is really at your discretion as the teacher. You know your students best. I'm just kind of giving you an example of how I would look through and try to find some words. And even the word ideas, I kind of threw that in there because when I came up with when I came up with a physical response for these words, ideas just kind of flowed in. So I'll show you that in just a moment. Now looking at this page, another thing I noticed was this word right here, diffusion. That's definitely a word that my students are going to not really know at this point, just knowing who they are. And one thing I just want to point out is that I'm going to be focusing on the definition of the word diffusion, not the phrase cultural diffusion, because cultural diffusion is more of that tier 3 vocabulary word or phrase. However, the word diffusion is not. Diffusion is definitely a tier 2 vocabulary word. They'll see it and use it in other subject areas. So it would be more beneficial for me to focus in on what diffusion means. And then they can use that context to figure out what cultural diffusion means later on in the lesson. So the first thing that I might do is just kind of hone in on 2 major words that I want to teach. You might go through the lessons and you might find that there are many words that your students would need support with, but for this to really work well, you just want to focus in on the most important ones. So I'm going to focus in on the word exchange and the word diffusion. What I would do is I would present these words really clearly on the board with very little distractions because you want your students to focus in on the physical response movement that you're going to give for this word. So for the word exchange, I came up with the movement just like an exchange, right? So exchange like that. So what I would do is I would teach my students the word, how to pronounce it. This is the word exchange. I would state the definition. Exchange means to trade different goods or services. So I would do this as I teach it, and I would have my students do it with me. So I'd say, students, this is the word exchange. Do this movement with exchange. 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 And then even throughout the lesson, every time you use that word, you can just do that movement so that students can see you doing that movement and they can use that movement too. And I came up with that movement because, like I said just a minute ago, it kind of looks like the word exchange, right? It looks like I'm exchanging something. So you want to think of a movement or something that you can do that relates to the meaning of the word so that it makes sense to students and so that it helps them remember what it means. For the word diffusion, I came up with the movement because diffusion means to spread out or to kind of to spread out. So this is kind of that movement I came up with for diffusion. You could use 2 fingers, but I liked kind of just using one, thinking that something's coming in and then that's diffusing everywhere else. So I'd do the same thing. I would say, students, this is the word diffusion. I would state the meaning of the word. And then as I say the word diffusion, I would show them the movement, I would teach them the movement, and I would have them do it too. So that every time they see this word diffusion, they're making that movement and it's really supporting them in understanding the word. Again, I came up with a movement that matches the meaning of the word so that my students can make that connection to the definition. And earlier when I talked about, using or also doing this for exchange of goods and services. If you wanted to add in goods and services and kind of give them a TPR or a total physical response for that whole phrase or idea, I was just thinking about doing something like exchange, goods, and ideas. So exchange, goods, and ideas. And I like this movement for goods because it actually shows them what this particular meaning of goods is, that it doesn't mean good like you did a good job. It means goods as in a product or an item that is being exchanged or traded. So overall, I hope this video gave you another really great tip for teaching vocabulary. I think that vocabulary can be the biggest, struggle sometimes when we're teaching social studies to students with IEPs. Even some of our ENL students or all students. And so this is a really great strategy that I've used in the past. My kids have loved it. They think it's so fun. If you do it enough, they can even start to come up with their own movements for the new words they're learning in social studies. But it's just a really great strategy. And you can do it on Zoom with your students. You could do it if you're back in person. So it can be used in many different ways. So I hope this helped you, and I will see you in my next video.